Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We partner with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn's Dust Diseases team have accumulated more than 20 years of experience in asbestos litigation and pride themselves on ensuring that their clients not only receive the best compensation result, but that they are supported during their stressful and traumatic time. And Maurice Blackburn are looking for a passionate full-time associate to join their Dust Diseases team in their Brisbane office. To apply, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. And that's the first time I've not fluffed that read. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out each Friday that dives into the progressive campaign issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we head back overseas today to Canada, where we're joined by a good buddy of mine, Dave Clark, who is a campaign practitioner working for a progressive campaign agency that does a lot of work with the NDP, which is the Social Democratic Party in Canada. And he's on today to talk about Canadian politics in general, but in particular this freedom convoy that's happening and clogging up the streets of the nation's capital in Ottawa. So Dave's on the show to talk a bit about that and the role that the NDP play in Canadian politics. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, please be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and on Spotify. When you're done listening to today's episode, leave us a review on Apple Podcast and Podchaser. And for all updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon in Melbourne, an overcast day today, actually, finally getting a bit of a break in the weather. And joining on the line from Toronto, Canada is a good mate of mine, Dave Clark, who's a campaigner working with a Canadian campaign agency that partners with the NDP, which is like the sister party of the ALP in Canada. Dave, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks very much for having me. Nice to see you, Stephen.
Nice to see you as well. Last time we caught up was, I think it was the 2016 federal election here in Australia. So it's been a long time between drinks. And as I asked you that question, how you been? You were having a big gulp of water there, so I apologise for that. But how have you been?
No, yeah, doing well. Lots has happened since 2016 in life and politically. But yeah, mostly for the most part back in Canada now, rather than in the UK for the last 5 years. And yeah, like everyone, pretty turbulent last couple of years through the pandemic, but doing okay.
So as our listeners will have picked up, you've got a bit of a British accent or an English accent there. And so my first question is, before we sort of jump into contemporary Canadian politics, how does someone with a British accent end up working in Canada for the progressive side of politics? What's the journey that Dave took to get involved in social democratic politics?
Yeah, I think first getting to Canada, firstly, that was about 10 years ago, and similar journey to a lot of Aussies who end up here as well. Came on a working holiday visa to begin with, straight out of university, really wanted to experience living and working somewhere different, and ended up really loving it here. Loving the people, loving Toronto as a city. And so, yeah, 10 years now I've been here, applying to be a citizen right now. So hopefully in the next year or so, I'll actually get to vote in an election after working on a couple dozen of them here. And yeah, then getting involved in politics didn't really grow up in like a political household at all. Politics was like something that happened and something that created the conditions that you're living in. And it wasn't until I moved here that I really got involved in politics. We organized a union in my workplace, in a coffee shop where I was working, and that was just because of a bad boss there. And a co-worker had encouraged me to get involved with the NDP, the New Democratic Party, which is the left party here. And then through those campaigns, just really saw the power of organizing, power of getting people, their skills and connections together to build power, and that was a way you could actually make a big difference on what life was like for you. So got the bug for campaigning and organizing people and around issues, and haven't stopped since then.
We're going to talk a lot about the second half of the program, I guess contemporary Canadian politics and the role that the NDP plays in mainstream political life in Canada. But I don't want to bury the lead, and I want to talk about this truck convoy that's happening in your nation's capital at the moment that is hitting all the major international news headlines. And I want to start with how did this all begin? Like, what are the reasons behind this? And I don't even want to say movement. I don't want to attribute this to being some sort of movement, but it certainly is a cluster of people that are clogging up the city of Ottawa. Where did this all begin? I'm assuming that the pandemic has got a lot to do with the embryonic reasons about how this all came about.
Yeah, it's definitely, you're right. Like the resentment towards government and towards increasingly making life increasingly getting more complicated for folks who don't want to get vaccinated, and harder for them to participate in things as mandates have come in. That's definitely the crux of it. The real catalyst moment for this has been some changes in regulations for truckers between the US and Canada that came in last month. So truckers crossing US-Canada border had an exemption from vaccine requirements for international travel for a good chunk of the pandemic to prevent supply chain problems. Canada's really heavily reliant on the US for trade. 2/3 of all of Canada's trade is with the US. So this exemption was really important to make sure goods could keep flowing. Those exemptions expired for both countries in the middle of January. And so Canadian truckers coming back into Canada from the US now who weren't vaccinated now need to isolate and take a PCR test for a number of days before they can continue to work. And it's increasingly difficult or impossible for folks to do those cross-border trips. They can still work within Canada. There's nothing stopping truckers continuing to work within the country, but that cross-border work is no longer possible for the 15% or so of Canadian truckers who aren't vaccinated. And so around that moment, you saw not really truckers themselves, but some of the usual suspects of right-wing Canadian politics pick this moment, pick this emblem of people bringing food and goods into the country being stamped on by the government, and organize around it. So the two leaders of this freedom convoy, as they call themselves, are not truckers themselves. They're usual suspects from right-wing Canadian politics and the separatists from the Western provinces of Canada, who organized this GoFundMe campaign, and planned to have this truck convoy cross Canada and head to Ottawa. Now, the GoFundMe has been hugely successful. It has been shut down now, but they raised $9 million through GoFundMe to pay for this thing. And as they were going through different cities and provinces, loads and loads of people were coming out and waving flags and showing support along highways as they were going. They ended up in Ottawa, and they've been there just coming up to 3 weeks now, and started an occupation of some of the downtown with really not the clearest, to be honest, not the clearest specific objectives. It really varies among the group. There's been calls for the government to step down, calls for all vaccine mandates to be removed. And then there's been these kind of copycat and growing process happening across Canada, outside of Ottawa too. The biggest of those have been at border crossings. So border crossing in Alberta, the one from Michigan into Ontario around Windsor and Detroit. Those borders have also been closed by folks protesting. So there's been a lot of disruption, both in the city of Ottawa and also to life across the country over the last 3 weeks.
I'm sort of reading about it in some of the papers over in Canada. Just give us a sense of what the experience is like in Ottawa right now. What are local, because the stories, there was one story actually I read in the New York Times, was quite funny. These Ottawans, is that what you would call people who are from Ottawa?
Yes. Right.
We're saying, we like our really boring, quiet life here, and we want to go back to being boring again. And that's not happening right now. And I guess they're being a bit glib, but also the point they were making was it's enough's enough. They want them to all leave. And seems to be the problem is that they can't seem to get them to move on. And they're bringing their own petrol in, and there's a whole bunch of measures the government have tried to do, I guess, to try and move them on. Can you talk us through what the experience is like going on in the capital right now?
Yeah, that's a good context setting of what Ottawa is like and how it's perceived within Canada. It's the seat of the federal government, but by no means the biggest city in Canada. It's really an administrative capital. So a pretty small city, as cities go. Not a reputation as a seat of government and a place for the public service and bureaucrats, and not an exciting place.
It's like Canberra, basically.
Yeah, that's a great parallel. Exactly like Canberra, and I think for folks outside, like myself, I'm in Toronto, so a few hours away. Hard to really understand the impact of what life is like there right now. We have an office in Ottawa, so half dozen of my colleagues are based there, and most of them haven't been working for the last 2 weeks because of the impact of what's going on. A big feature of this protest that borders really on torture tactics is 24/7 honking of truck horns, like through residential neighborhoods. And if you're working from home, like a lot of people are, like it's all day, every day, unending noise for a lot of people. And like the impact after 2 years of really challenging times for people's mental health, I think just can't understate how damaging that is when you've got no escape in your home of this thing that's happening. Another big feature has been street harassment of pretty much anyone wearing masks or like visibly following public health guidance, and whole areas of the downtown being kind of difficult places to go on foot if you're someone who wants to wear a mask in public, as the public guidelines suggest you should.
Talk to me a bit about the makeup of the group or the folks that are on the ground that are holding this protest, this freedom convoy. I watched this weekend's episode of Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO, and they talked about the what's going on in Ottawa at the moment. I must admit, 90% of the time on that show, I tend to agree with what Bill or his guests have got to say. But on this particular occasion, I didn't really agree with it. They were trying to make out that we should in some way empathise with these truckers because it's the global elites that have left them behind, that they have no voice, no one's listening to them, and therefore they've agitated about a whole bunch of different reasons, and that's why they're kicking off here right now, and that they've been left behind and they've fallen through the cracks because of the COVID pandemic. And I'm listening to them saying that, and I'm just sort of thinking, well, I don't think they are doing that. Just from what I can read, the issue really is about freedom of movement back and forth across the border, and their issues with having to take a vaccination. And nothing more than that. What do you think is what is the motivating factor behind these people getting involved in this campaign?
Yeah, I think some of those things are like those issues around being able to do your job and cross borders when that's something you need to do for your job are important things to consider. I don't think that's the driving force from what we're seeing now behind, firstly, the people who are organizing this protest and then the majority of people who are participating. I think there is like an element of people, everyone, whether you're a supporter or not of these protests, is very frustrated with the last 2 years. Like there's been lots of flip-flopping from different levels of government on restrictions, things opening up, things closing. In Toronto, we had the longest lockdown of any city in North America earlier in the pandemic, and people are frustrated because they felt that their leaders on one side haven't done enough to contain the pandemic, and on another side, which is this protest, are going above and beyond what they should be doing to contain COVID. So while I think I would say I agree with what you're saying around like the specific conditions that are happening with truckers, but what we're seeing is 85% of truckers are fully vaccinated. The majority of truckers are continuing to be able to do their jobs. And of those 15%, they can continue to do their job within Canada, which is a huge country. It's one specific type of route they're unable to do. So I do think there's been a co-opting of this issue because truckers bringing food and resources into the country is a sympathetic messenger and it's being co-opted by a lot more folks from the broader right wing. That's been really apparent in the protests. There's been swastika flags, there's been Confederate flags waved at protests, and like I said, with the organisers, the usual suspects of far-right politics in Canada, really using this as, I think, a recruiting opportunity for people who are frustrated at governments, giving them an outlet for that channels them towards far-right politics.
Melbourne, over the winter, obviously Australia's gone through a similar kind of experience to Canada, and we've had pretty harsh, I would say harsh, we've had clear lockdowns that have happened, and the state that I'm from, Melbourne, Victoria, has had the most out of all of the states across the country. And through the sort of second half of 2021, we had a number of protests running through the CBD of Melbourne. And just looking at the groups there, there's a lot of similarities to what you're talking about and the experience that's going on in Ottawa right now. A lot of right-wing groups are jumping on these protests. But I've also seen, it's almost as if it's like that horseshoe theory we talk about, where we've got the radical left and the radical right kind of getting around and meeting each other in the middle, or getting quite close to each other. I think there was elements within sort of hard left politics that were getting involved in the Australian protests as well as the hard right. Is that a case that you're seeing in Canada as well, or is it, as you've just said there, it mostly has been led by the radical right in Canadian politics? And follow-up question: you mentioned something before about Western separatists. Now that sounds like something out of like a Star Wars novella. What are these Western? Who are these Western separatists you speak of, Dave?
Yeah, on the Western separatist question, Canada's this huge country, really different culture and politics all across the country, really different way of life for a lot of people. And in recent years, there's been, particularly since 2016, a growing separatist sentiment. I wouldn't say it's anything like where we got with Brexit yet. It's still a very fringe movement. But we had the Wexit Party, which was the Western exit, who were campaigning for separation from the rest of Canada. We've also seen the more legitimately, like the provincial government in Alberta talking about some of these things around, like, could Alberta separate? Could we demand more power? And the economy in Alberta is really dependent on resource extraction. And so there's been a feeling that Alberta is generating a lot of money for Canada, but being left behind in terms of policy making by elites from big cities and from Ontario and Quebec. So that's Wexit, and what's going on there. Still not really a big established movement within Canadian politics, but definitely like a growing alienation among Western provinces. And can you repeat your other question?
So yeah, I was just wondering, is the protests sort of a hybrid mix of?
Oh, right, the left and right coming together. Yeah, in terms of the protests coming, seeing right-wing and left-wing folks coming together on an organized level, there hasn't really been anything that I've seen or heard of from the hard left. That's predominantly been like the known right extremist groups who have been quite involved in these protests. I do think there's a much bigger and quite dangerous group there. I mentioned before about how the right wing is using this as a recruiting opportunity, but there's a big group of people who probably saw themselves as not particularly political, who see this as like a reaction to the frustration that they felt over the last couple of years and an outlet for that frustration, who are being radicalized by what's happening right now. There's a lot of there's been a lot of talk of families among the folks with trucks downtown. Lots of kids currently living in those trucks, and it's quite concerning the way that folks are being whipped up around existing right-wing politics through this issue.
You share a border with the United States, and I'm just wondering about how much US politics and the politics of Donald Trump has influenced this convoy. It's kind of bizarre in Australia. We do see the odd Trump flag at some of these protests, which doesn't make sense to me because there's a whole Pacific Ocean between us and the United States, what Trump politics has to do. But you do share a border with the United States, and I'm wondering if there is an influence of US politics seeping into the Canadian the Freedom Convoy.
Definitely some common ground. there's definitely elements of it that feel a little bit like cosplaying of right-wing American movements. So the Confederate flags, it make no sense when you consider Canada's history. It makes no sense for people to support the Confederacy in Ottawa in 2022. There's definitely, though, there is an American support for it materially. Like there was, as I mentioned, like a $9 million GoFundMe that provided a lot of resources for this convoy, including things like renting trucks for non-truckers to lend that increased legitimacy, and then supplies. You mentioned fuel. There's been a leak of donors who donated through that GoFundMe, and American donors outnumbered Canadians by about 2 to 1. So a significant amount of the money that came in to support the convoy has come from overseas. And that's increasingly a way people are looking at this. Is there a foreign interference element in this? Because it's so heavily funded, it's very clearly funded to a large degree from the United States. How much of that is a concern? I think the other thing that has brought in some American influence is like how this story appeals to right-wing American media, because it appears to be like a show of solidarity for right-wing reactionary politics in another country, in a country that's often seen as like quite socially liberal and is right next door. I would say, though, it's really important not to dismiss what's happening as like an American phenomenon that Canada's just jumping onto. There's been a real rise in right-wing extremism in Canada over the last number of years, a big spike of online activity for right-wing extremist groups during the pandemic. Again, using that issue as a way to recruit and a way to radicalize people who are on the fringes of their movements. So I think it's important that, yes, there's elements of American influence in this, but right-wing extremism is a Canadian problem as well. And it's something that hasn't just come up in the last couple of years.
It's interesting you say that. We had a Labor senator on the podcast probably 12 months ago, Christina Keneally, was talking about the rise of right-wing extremism in Australia and how the federal Conservative government aren't taking this issue seriously enough, even though our security agencies are saying to them, hey, we've got to start to pay attention to this.
Yeah.
And just also watching the way that I guess you'd call them the Murdoch media legitimise these protests through their print and their TV here in Australia as well doesn't help. And then you see the mainstream conservative centre-right parties playing footsies with these groups. Some of their MPs would go out and address some of the crowds and things like that. Just actually kind of kick this story along a little bit. When in actual fact, the vast majority of Australians don't agree with them, don't support what they're doing, and they're in such a minority that if we like to equate sort of scenarios to paint to Australians about the ratios of difference would be how many people could you fill the MCG with the Melbourne Cricket Ground. I don't think these truckers would so I don't think these protesters here in Australia would equate to 2 or 3 seats out of 100,000 stadium, right? So they are such a small minority. What's the perception of this protest by just regular Canadians across the country?
Yeah, I think it's concerning how much this issue is resonating with people outside of the fringe, even though it's led very much, but it's very much a fringe-led movement. There's polling that has in the region of 30 to 35% of Canadians saying that they support what's happening. Still, even with everything that's happened over the last 3 weeks in Ottawa, it is like a clear majority of folks who are saying, no, this should end. Action should be taken immediately to stop it, around the 70% mark. I think something else that's why I say this is like a phenomenon in Canada that's been coming for a number of years and growing. There's this legitimate side of right-wing politics here too. And I had this perception when I was back in the UK. I'm sure folks in Australia do too, of Canada as this progressive, socially liberal country. But they've increasingly been electing right-wing politicians and governments. We had Stephen Harper for a long time at the federal level. Right now, we have quite beyond centre-right governments in Alberta and in Ontario. Doug Ford, who's a former Mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford's brother, is the Premier here in Ontario. And then in the last election, we saw the PPC, which is the People's Party, which is a new offshoot of the Conservative Party, an anti-immigration far-right party that tripled their vote share, got 5% of the popular vote, almost 1 million votes all across Canada. So there's this growing legitimization of right-wing politics coming as well, which is quite concerning.
Where to from here, Dave? I know that you and I sort of discussed off mic that this is a moving beast and moving quite quickly at the moment. As we're recording this on a Tuesday and we'll punch this out on a Friday, so this all could change again. But how does this scenario play out in the end?
Yeah, I think like you might have something similar in Australia, but there's one thing that's been highlighted through the pandemic here is we have a federal government and then provincial governments responsible for different things. And pandemic response, like many things, spans a couple of different jurisdictions. And so it becomes really easy for governments that don't like each other to kick responsibility between the two. And that's something that we've seen in the response to these protests. The federal government has said something must be done by the province. Province has said something must be done by the City of Ottawa. City of Ottawa said, well, we don't direct the police. They should be doing something. So I think a lot of people's frustration at like how nothing has happened to deal with this over the last 2.5 weeks has come from that. Now today, and like you say, this is moving really quickly. So today being Monday here in Canada, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, which is a measure that's never before been invoked in Canada's history. And it gives the federal government power to take additional action beyond what is usually under its purview. And they have to have the consent of the province to do this. They have Ontario's consent. This allows them to do things like declare areas of national importance no-go zones. So that includes airports and border crossings. It allows them to requisition equipment so that they can tow trucks that they've said they haven't been able to move out of downtown Ottawa. And it gives them significantly more power as a federal government to step in and try and end these protests. And that is hopefully what we're going to see over the next week or so.
So it potentially could kick off as well. I mean, if there's an appetite for violence from the protests, it potentially could, I mean, we don't want this to be the case, but it could turn ugly.
Yeah, I think that's been the concern for a lot of people and is one of the reasons law enforcement will say that they have moved fairly slowly on this. There was a series of arrests today at the border crossing between Alberta and Montana, where a significant amount of firearms, body armor, quite heavy weapons were seized, and a number of arrests were made. And that's the kind of thing that I think people really don't want to see. They don't want to see this become quite unpleasant. So yeah, there is concern. I would say that there's already, for people living in Ottawa, a pretty serious material impact on their lives right now. In addition to the disruption I talked about, there's been stories of protesters attempting to light fires in apartment buildings where residents have been vocal in their opposition to the protests. So it's not like right now this is a peaceful protest. It may not be physically violent, but there's nothing peaceful about what's happening.
Let's turn to Canadian politics in general, and for Labor people here in Australia that have paid any attention to Canadian politics, they often ask the question, which team do we support? Because there are two political parties in Canada that both purport to be centre-left political parties. There's the Liberals and there's the NDP, of which you're from. They're both regarded as sister parties to the, I guess, the International Progress Alliance, which is sort of the body that is like a geopolitical body that sort of oversees all the different social democratic and Labor parties around the world. And it's always a bit awkward when you go to these international conferences and there's there's guys from the Liberals and from you guys, and you're like, who do we go and hang out with? Who do we go have a beer with after the session? I always have a beer with you, Dave. Don't you worry about that. What's the difference between these two parties?
Yeah, I've had this conversation many times with folks back in the UK Labour Party, and it's made even harder because the Liberals got to the colour red before the NDP did. So we're out of the colour scheme with everyone else, we're orange. Yeah, I think the clearest way to explain it is the history of the NDP is tied to the trade union movement. It's founded by trade unions and farmers. The Liberal Party has a long history as the governing party in Canada. We had a divided Conservative Party for a very long time, and so decades and decades of Liberal federal governments. But in power, what we've seen from the Liberal Party is it's a party for elites, for big business. It's a party that hasn't aligned itself with working people. They have a long history of campaigning to the left and governing to the right, of breaking promises and of not standing up for working people when it's counted. The landscape in Canada is interesting for the NDP. The NDP's never federally held government. It's still a fairly young party, coming up on I think it's the 60th anniversary this year. Never federally held government, but held government provincially in almost every province. Particularly in BC, there's a very long tradition of NDP governments in holding power there. So it's a big challenge for the NDP in how to be seen as relevant at the federal level.
You've worked on campaigns for the Labor Party in the UK and in Australia, and obviously as well as in Canada. Talk to us about the primary focus of Canadian-style campaign politics. Where does the resource allocation go? What are the similarities that you saw between, say, a traditional campaign in the UK and in Canada, and where are the stark differences where there's a different kind of focus and attention in campaigning?
Yeah, so it's a very similar system to the UK, parliamentary, first past the post, democracy. We have 338 MPs at the federal level across Canada. A big difference in campaigning in terms of resources is that there's very, very limited public funding for political parties in Canada. That was something that Stephen Harper scrapped while he was in power. There's very strict donation limits. You can't take donations from trade unions or from corporations. So the way that you fund your campaigning is extremely constrained, and often means lower budgets. At a federal level, the other problems you're contending with are a huge area that you're campaigning in. It's a massive country. You have to have a plane if you're going to run a national campaign. And you're also, if you're a serious party that wants to win government, you're running a bilingual campaign. Quebec, it has a huge number of seats. There's lots of francophones outside of Quebec as well. So you need a campaign that resonates in at least two different languages to make an impact. So similar system to the UK, very, very different landscape in terms of the resources that you have available and how you're trying to stretch them. There is a big focus certainly in NDP campaigns on the field campaign. That's a long point of pride is that when not having the resources that Liberals and Conservatives have, the NDP runs strong, people-powered local campaigns in their target seats. And I think as well, you're starting to see that become a bit more sophisticated with more technology and more tools coming into campaigning as well.
I mean, that was my follow-up question. How much has data and analytics played a role in driving campaign efficiencies for the NDP over recent years, as opposed to your opponents, both the Conservatives and the Liberals?
Yeah, it feels like over the last 10 years, there's been some really big strides forward for the NDP in modernising how we campaign. The party had their best ever federal election result in 2011, won over 100 seats nationally, became the official opposition behind the Conservatives and overtook the Liberals. And I think that was a moment where people started to look at campaigning in a more professional way and recognize the tools and the edge that you could get to field campaigning by bringing in more professionalization. So data modeling or voter modeling using lots of different data points is something that's kind of been new in that last 10 years to the party. A lot more digital campaign tools, a lot more texting and tools that allow people to campaign from home have been coming in over the last couple of cycles. As that's become more necessary. So definitely modernizing for sure. Again, limited by the financial resources that are available. It's a totally different world from the United States and some of the technology available there, but definitely improving.
You had an election last August, is that right?
September.
Oh, September, yeah. Last year though. It was last year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So this COVID thing has just completely stuffed my concept of time. From 2020 to now, it's just basically 1 year that has gone for a lot, but it also feels like it's gone for a decade. How did you guys go, and this is a question that I know a lot of our field organisers and volunteers and campaigners will be interested in hearing. How do you guys go with your field operation with canvassing, so knocking on doors during COVID? Because we're about to have a federal election here in Australia at any time now, and also we'll have a South Australian election is basically in the offing at the moment. They're up on the last Saturday in March, and then there's a Victorian state election at the end of this year as well. So there's a lot of campaigning to be done. We are effectively still in a COVID period, although the restrictions are varying a bit at the moment because we're in our summer. But how did you guys go with dealing with lockdowns and trying to keep social distancing, but also maintaining a field operation?
Yeah, so it was in September. I think one thing we were quite fortunate about with how the NDP campaigns and where our strength is, it was during a period when COVID cases were down in Canada. There was a lot, because it was a snap election that had been rumored for a long time. There was a lot of concern about how this was going to work. And as things rolled out, there was definitely concern about how we were going to campaign in a COVID environment. But ultimately, particularly in target seats, canvassing in the way we would usually canvass, as long as it wasn't inside apartment buildings, was largely possible. Yep. There was lots of work done to make sure that folks who were volunteering and who were getting involved were vaccinated, and that was something that they visibly displayed when they were campaigning too. Okay. And generally found that there wasn't much pushback on that from people at the doors.
Okay, that's good. So obviously, wearing masks and socially distancing, knocking on the doors, but stepping back from the door, letting people know they were vaccinated, all that kind of stuff was the kind of precautions you guys took.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and then as I said, like more tools coming in to let people phone back from home. Less people are coming into offices and being confined indoor spaces was part of it too.
Yeah, excellent. Your leader, and forgive me for, I'm going to get his first name wrong, I'm sure. Jagmeet, is it Jagmeet Singh?
Jagmeet, yeah.
Yep, who's the leader?
Jagmeet Singh.
Who's an interesting guy. Tell us a bit about his story.
Yeah, really interesting person. He's been the leader of the federal NDP since 2017. Before that, he was a provincial MP in Ontario since 2011. So he's been involved as an elected official for just over 10 years with the NDP. Made the jump from provincial politics to federal in 2017, running the leader of the party. He was a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, before he was involved in politics. Really, really interesting leader, an interesting change in direction, quite an exciting one for the NDP. Jagmeet's the first person of color to lead a major political party in Canada. He's wears visible articles of faith to turban seat. And in federal politics in particular, that has led to a lot of challenging conversations for a lot of different parts of Canada around Canada, which prides itself on being a multicultural, multiracial society, willing or able to embrace a leader who is so visibly from a minority group. So there's been, I'm sure lots of folks would have seen a number of viral moments from different campaigns where he's confronted that racism with a lot of kindness and openness and bravery. And that's inspired a lot of people to get involved in politics and see themselves represented.
What's the shape of the NDP at the moment following the recent national elections? Like, where's the party strong, and where do you want to make inroads so you can hopefully one day govern?
Yeah, it was a strange election in 2021. I think if people are being honest, there's definitely some disappointment in the party that more progress wasn't made in the last federal election. Trudeau called a snap election during the pandemic, had a minority government. The result we got after the election was almost exactly the same, eerily so. Like a couple of seats changed hands, but largely it balanced out almost identical to how the balance had been before. And I think the NDP ran quite an aggressive campaign, had lots of ambitions of making some gains, and really didn't make a lot of them. I can speak in particular about Toronto, where I am, just seen as like a progressive city and a place that the NDP has had representation before. We've had 25 out of 25 MPs in Toronto since 2015 have been Liberals, so we weren't able to make any inroads here. So that was certainly disappointing. In terms of the shape the party's in, I think they're on a good path. Jagmeet is consistently polling as the most popular leader of any political party in Canada. I think the challenge is going to be how to translate that personal brand into votes and winning seats in future elections.
Do you find yourselves competing against both the Liberals and the Conservatives in it's ridings over there, not electorates? Yep.
Ridings, yeah.
I love that name.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Is it electorates?
Yeah, we call them electorates in Australia.
Yeah.
Like when you're looking for where you're, I mean, are you running a marginal seat campaign where you're just targeting the seats that your data tells you you're going to be most competitive, and so it turns out that it's a mix that you can be in three-way races, or in some cases you're running just purely against the Conservatives, and some other races you're just running against Liberals? How does that look like strategically? How do you work that out?
Yeah, the actual three-way races are pretty rare. There's some provinces that certainly go in three directions, BC being one of them, where the NDP is really competitive federally, but it's really a three-way race. But most ridings will either be where the NDP is competitive, it'll either be up against a Liberal or up against a Conservative. It's rare that there's all three of them fighting over the same seat. So it really varies, and it depends where you are. In cities, in particular, in Toronto, very rare that you'll be running with a competitive Conservative as the opposition. It's usually against a Liberal candidate. And then in some of the more rural parts of the province, but in particular, some of the post-industrial parts of the province, or places where there's been a really strong labour movement. There's a big auto sector in southwestern Ontario, or in the steel sector around Hamilton. Those are places that we're often competing with Conservatives. And it's the same we see in other countries where Conservatives are making real inroads among working class union members. And so it's a very different race depending on where you are.
Just to pick up on that point, that's interesting because, I mean, obviously that's a commonality that the NDP share with the Labor Party, both Britain and in Australia, is that we are parties that are of the trade union movement. It's something that we've had to grapple with to some degree, and not just necessarily just recently as well. I think when I was a young trade union official or organiser with the Transport Workers Union, I think in the 2004 federal election, we surveyed our members, and it came back that around about 40 to 45% of our members had voted Conservative at that federal election. And I think that number amongst, blue collar unions probably sort of, ebbs and flows depending on, the perception of Labor. How is the NDP grappling with their base being infiltrated by Conservative politics? Like, how do you inoculate that? How do you fight back against that? Is there a lot of sort of hand wrenching amongst the leadership about that issue?
Yeah, it's really challenging. It was certainly something that has been crystallized over the last 2 years. One thing we didn't talk about with the Convoy is the political impact of the Convoy that has traveled to Ottawa to ostensibly depose Trudeau. What they've actually achieved was to knock out the Conservative leader. Erin O'Toole, who was leader of the Conservative Party going into the last election, had been the leader for 2 years. And for folks on the left, I think we were very concerned for a time about Erin O'Toole because he was from an auto worker community. His father had worked in an auto factory and had really built a brand around appealing to working class union members and softening some of the typical Conservative rhetoric and really talking and appealing to workers. Ultimately, the Conservative Party here is quite a fractured coalition. And so when the Convoy came into town, O'Toole supported the Convoy, walked that back when there were these symbols of hate that were seen among protesters, and then his caucus got rid of him because there's such division there. There's a lot of folks who support the Convoy among his caucus. So we ultimately didn't see this campaign, which was like a true blue Conservative campaign targeting blue collar workers that we were quite concerned of. But I think that just pushes the concern down the line. We need to figure out how to talk to the folks in our base who are socially liberal and live in big cities, and often are union members themselves, but in very different professions, and are doing well as a result of their union membership. And folks who live in very different communities where they're seeing their employers and their jobs and the quality of life that they get from their union membership declining over time. How can we also be a party for those folks? There's definitely some hand-wringing. There's definitely a tension between those two constituencies, and it's certainly challenging to try and bridge the two.
I guess that is, and that's the thing. I mean, like you think about the Labor Party, we talk ourselves up as a broad church or a big tent party in which we're trying to keep together our blue collar working class base that predominantly live in the outer suburbs with our inner city educated academic elites, and it's not easy to do at times. But it's certainly important to continue to be a broad church if we're going to have electoral success and have governments. What's the focus for the NDP going forward? What elections do you have coming up on the horizon?
Yeah, we've got a big one coming up in June. So the Ontario election, just every 4 years, coming up in June. The NDP goes into that in their strongest ever position, apart from their time in government, as the opposition. We had a Liberal government for 10 years until 2018 that was routed, lost official party status. So Doug Ford is the premier right now, and the Ontario NDP goes into that election with a real shot at winning and forming government. That's in June, and then coming up next year as well as the Alberta election. So we had an NDP government in Alberta, which is always seen as like a hardcore conservative province. They lost power in the last election, but are polling at times 20 points ahead of the Conservatives right now. So a real chance to fight back there too.
Fantastic. Well, Dave, we wish you and the party all the success for the coming elections, and also thank you for taking time out of your schedule to come on to Social Democratic and have a chat to us about Canadian politics.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for having me.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.